Hi, good morning, everybody. We are ripping from the headlines a story that wasn't very widely reported in the. I couldn't really find articles in the secular press. I did notice it in some of the Jewish press outlets. And we're going to start actually by looking at a couple of Jewish sources before launching into the issue at hand. And in particular, it has to do with our children responsible for the mistakes that their parents make. And we actually covered this the concept in terms of the children paying the price with regards to, we talked about vaccine mandates and keeping children out of school if their parents don't want to have the children vaccinated or themselves aren't vaccinated. But just the idea of being responsible if you didn't commit the sin. And there are a couple of verses, and we just had the fast of Asar B'Teves last week, and the question starts with one of the verses there, because we say that Hashem is poked avon avos al banim al bnei banim al shileshim be'al ribeim, that God remembers and revisits the sins for generations. So that seems to imply that there is a continuity, that the next generation can be held responsible for the sins of the earlier one. But we also have a verse that seems to imply that ish bechet'o yumas, that a person is punished or dies for their sin only. And so the Gemara in Sanhedrin, source number 1, asked this question. The Gemara asks, and are children not put to death for the sins of the fathers? Isn't it written, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children's children, onto the third, onto the fourth generation? The Gemara answer is there. The verse is referring to a situation where the children adopt the actions of their ancestors as their own. If they do not behave like their ancestors, they're not punished for their ancestors' sins. And the idea that, yes, the next generation will be punished for the sins of their parents if they continue in those wicked ways. So that's how the Gemara in Sanhedrin answers it. It still doesn't seem to necessarily completely answer the situation. Like, why should you be held responsible for something that you don't do? And in fact, the Gemara in Makos presents another possible way of understanding this concept. Source number 2, Moshe said he visits the transgression of the fathers upon the sons. Right, the pasuk that we're dealing with, that sins get passed on to the generations. Yecheskel, the prophet, came and revoked this idea. The soul that sins, it shall die, and not the children of that soul. The idea that, there is an idea of holding the next generation accountable for the sins of their parents, even if they don't commit the sin. But Yecheskel said, Moshe wanted that to be the case, but we don't apply that anymore. And this comes up because, people ask, from a religious perspective, from a philosophical perspective, why should the sins be passed down to the next generation? And so, one answer in the Talmud would be, no, that only happens if the next generation perpetuates the sins of the earlier generation. And other approaches, no, look, that only happened, that was Moshe's intent. Moshe wanted to put more responsibility on parents to do the right thing, because otherwise the sins get passed on to the children. Nevertheless, Yecheskel came along and said that that was Moshe's intent, to have the responsibility passed from generation to the next. But that's not how it works in real life. We don't say that children are punished for the sins of their parents. So that's the religious idea of children paying the price of their parents' sins. Either if it seems that they are punished, it's because they're continuing in the wicked ways, or I think the more definitive response is the Gemara in Makos. Maybe that on a certain level of seeking a certain type of religious perfection or religious higher level, then we look at sins passing down if they're not addressed. Right, it's parents' sin; they don't get punished. The children will get punished for those sins. Moshe, maybe on a certain elitist level, looked at it that way, and comes Yecheskel several generations later, a couple hundred years later, and says that's not how it works. People are responsible for their own actions, and it doesn't get passed on to the next. So from a theological level, that's how it works. But a practical level, there still are after effects. And the case I wanted to look at has to do with in the Hasidic community. And source number 3 is from VIN News. Anyone familiar with VIN News? It's a Jewish news service. VIN stands for Was is Nice, which is what is new. And it is, it's a parallel with Yeshiva World News and Matzav.com, a number of news outlets, especially in the metropolitan New York area, that covers items of interest to the Jewish community. If you ever at a New York City government, a New York State event, you'll be able to tell which are the reporters from these outlets, because they're wearing black coats and long black beards or gray beards, but it's in the religious community. And there was a situation that requires a little bit of introduction. And you see the headline: restraining order issued against New York Gore School, which suspended children of Shaul's adherents. So this is something that's taking place in the Gerrer community. Gerrer Chasidic community is one of the largest Hasidic groups out there, very much centered in Israel, with a large community here as well. And the Gerrer Chasidic dynasty was founded in the 19th century by a rabbi who lived in the town of Ger, but Rabbi Yitzhak Meir Alter, Chidushei Harim, was the first Rebbe of Ger, and his grandson, Rabbi Aryeh Yehuda Aryeh Leib Alter, was known as the Rebbe of the Sfas Emes. And it was always a well-known group committed to Torah study and Hasidic practice. In the early days of the Hasidic movement, the Hasidim were not known for putting as much emphasis on Torah study. The Gerrer Chasidic community was a notable exception at that time, and continues to be well known for the excellence of the yeshiva. They, like all Hasidic groups in Eastern Europe, suffered decimation at the hands of the Holocaust, but were able to rebuild, with the Rebbe going to Israel and the community setting up in other major metropolitan areas. And it's a very strong community in Israel, where they're very involved in Israeli politics. When you hear about the UTJ party, United Torah Judaism, which combines the Hasidic and non-Hasidic ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, the Hasidic community taking a lead on this is the Gerrer Chasidim. They took an active role in what's called Agudas Yisrael, Agudath Israel, which we are familiar with here in America, but its Israeli version, which was involved in Israeli politics. The Gerrer Hasidim and the Gerrer Rebbe directed the Hasidim's involvement. So they're very active. They also, in recent years, took a leading role in encouraging the Hasidic community to take steps that would make it more economically feasible for them to subsist and exist in a comfortable way. Large Hasidic families are not so involved in the workforce. So, for example, the Gerrer Hasidim set up communities in some places in Israel that were off the beaten path. Right? We think of Jerusalem as where all Hasidim gather. That's good, but prices are high, and so they sent offshoots of the community to places like Ashdod, which is more south near the coast, but also more affordable housing. Also instituting different rules within the community for how big weddings should be and how much to spend on them and everything like that. So this is the community, but a couple of years ago, there was a split in the community, and one of them, they took a different approach to how the educational institutions would work. You can look at a lot of this online. As with any time there's friction within a Hasidic community, you'll get both sides of the story being presented, each one claiming to be in the right. And they changed things around, and essentially one of the outcomes was that the main yeshiva of the Gerrer Hasidim in Jerusalem was shut down, and students sent to different other institutions. And the very popular and learned and well-known head of that yeshiva was kind of left hanging off to the side within the leadership structure of the Gerrer Chasidic community. And as is often the case, he is a descendant of one of the Hasidic Rebbes. He was a child of one of the previous grandchild of one of the previous Rebbes. I don't remember the exact family tree, but all of a sudden, Rav Shaul Alter, who had been head of the yeshiva, is now off to the side without his yeshiva anymore. and all these changes taking place, and a whole bunch of disaffected, disappointed Hasidim wanted him to be installed into a role within the community. So it's not uncommon, and maybe you're familiar with this. Another group, Satmar, for example, has its Williamsburg branch, has its Kiryat Joel branch, right? So that's not uncommon for there to be different branches. So a branch started with Rav Shaul as its leader, and this wasn't really taken very well by the Gerrer Rebbe and the mainstream leadership, and there were some disputes, and this goes back, several years already, and some of the Israeli version of this story took place already in 2019, but now all of a sudden it's the schism is beginning to come to America. And it happens to be that Rav Shaul just last month visited the New York area and came through the metropolitan area, went through the 5 towns, and went through Lakewood, and went to Muncie, and spent Shabbos in Borough Park with a tent that was constructed that held 10,000 people. And he was teaching classes, and some of the American institutions have been set up, and he was visiting them. One of the, obviously all this costs money, so it was a fundraising trip, and at the Shabbos service, they auction off the aliyahs to give supporters a chance to show some generosity, but also to purchase aliyahs. And in the Hasidic community, the most expensive aliyah is shishi. Right, the different aliyahs, have different statuses attached to them. People think the 3rd aliyah is the most important. The maftir aliyah is the most important. So, but shishi in the Hasidic community is most important. So one of the donors purchased shishi for the Rebbe to give the Rebbe the shishi aliyah, since it's the most important, and he paid $1 million for shishi. So that's an expensive aliyah. So this is all going on. But what happened though is that that schism coming to America, what the followers of Rav Shaul, who were very excited that he's being here, and some of the American followers were beginning to ally themselves with him, drew the ire of the mainstream Gerrer Chasidic community. And it turned out that children of fathers who attended Rav Shaul's classes, appearances, or were associating themselves in davening in those shuls that were associated with the Rav Shaul. So if your father went to that shul, then there was a group of girls from a Beis Yaakov who were expelled. So talk about the sins of the father. So if the father goes to the wrong shul, the girls are now being expelled because their father is doing something wrong by allying himself with the rival Rebbe. And so this, which had taken place, this had been a fight in Israel a couple of years ago, now has come home to roost here in New York, here in Borough Park. And so this issue is not really rising into the mainstream media, but it was certainly something that those in the Hasidic community were familiar with, and the Gerrer Chasidim in particular. So you had a group of girls who were being expelled from school because their fathers went to the wrong Rebbe, or davened in the wrong shul, or participated in events with the other side. So, this is
Hey, Rabbi, what about the sons?
So, they're different. The sons who go to there already are alternate institutions for some, but they don't yet have a girls' school. Remember, this is a very nascent Hasidic group. And so that more than that in terms of where all the sons go, I have not yet seen reported. But it was the girls were the most vulnerable for retribution, and that's what was taken. And so here, though, we're in America, so they sued. And so you see, source number 3, the Supreme Court of New York State issued a restraining order in favor of the parents of children of the Beis Yaakov, the Chasidei Gur, whose children were suspended from the school after their fathers attended the Tish of Rabbi Shaul Alter in Brooklyn last week. Temporary restraining order, which is in effect for the next month, requires the school to refrain from suspending or expelling girls from Beis Yaakov, the Chasidei Gur, because of their religious practices, sequestering girls to a segregated room because of their religious practices, harassing the infant plaintiff because of her religious practices, taking any action against the infant plaintiff because of her religious practices. Moreover, the restraining order is conditioned and shall remain in effect, so long as the girls follow all the rules of Beis Yaakov the Chasidic, or refrain from disparaging Rabbi Yaakov. So the court is finding in favor of these girls who have been expelled. They have to be let back in, but they have to be careful not to say anything bad about the Gerrer Rebbe. And we'll see, because one of the ways the school is trying to justify expelling them is that these girls, just by being from families whose fathers go to the rival, that's disparaging the Rebbe. So an order also requires the school to explain within the next month why there would be grounds for suspending, sequestering, or harassing girls because of their religious practices. About 100 children were suspended from attending the school after their fathers went to the Tisha Rabbi Shaul Alter despite a directive from the Rebbe, Rabbi Yaakov, not to attend any functions of Rabbi Shaul. So you have an intercommunal dispute, you have rival Rebbes, you have it playing out in a school, the school wishing to follow the Rebbe's directives and kick the girls out. But it's America, and they sued, and there seems to be back and forth. And at the same time, the secular court is mindful of where this is going and recognizes that you can't expel the girls, but everyone has to respect the Rebbe, because by disrespecting the Rebbe, then the families or the students in particular are breaking the contract that they had with going to school in the first place, which would then justify their expulsion. So that is the case. And here we have an example where clearly the girls are paying for the sins of their fathers. Now, they're definitely paying by being expelled. Is it a real sin of the father to attend? Is this really a sin? It becomes the question. We know that they're paying for it, but is it a sin? And we're going to have to go a little bit deeper into a couple of issues. One, what kind of behavior of parents would carry over into the children with regards to education, and maybe a larger issue just in terms of when can or should a school be able to expel a student. In many ways, starting with Rabbi Yoshua ben Gamla in the Talmud, telling the story of his establishment of a system of schools, education has been, a sacred obligation of the community. Can a student be expelled? And and is there behavior that would justify that in the first place? And can the behavior of parents be applied and implemented to so that the children would be the ones to pay the price and lose their spot in school because of that? So that's where we're at. So that's by way of introduction, presenting the principles, questions, comments, thoughts. Happy to pause here.
Rabbi,
Yes.
back to the original pasuk, Poked avon avot al banim.
Right.
Me poked avon avot al banim. It's Hashem.
Right.
So why do these people even have the authority to punish for a sin that I don't understand?
Okay. So again, we're going to have to see that, of course, the divine gets. The divine is a certain model. Which then has human repercussions, human ramifications. And in general, according to Gemara and Makos, we stop doing that. Everyone's responsible for their own activity, their own behavior. Obviously, what we do doesn't take place in a vacuum, so we're going to have to see what kind of parental behavior may be able to be passed on, consequences passed on to children.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
Many years ago, I asked Murray Varova how to explain the Holocaust. As you know, Linda's brother and sister were killed by the Nazis. And his answer was, it was because of the sins of their parents. I cannot buy that. These were infant children, 10 and 12.
So I think we've seen here that that's not a traditional Jewish response, right? There may have been an expression of God's view of the universe that you do revisit the sins of parents onto children, but the rabbinic understanding of that is that may have been an aspiration or that may have been temporary, and now we don't do that anymore. Everyone is responsible for their own actions. Now, parents' sinful behavior may lead to kids who also grow up following in that sinful behavior. doesn't mean there's no repercussions, but in terms of, I guess, divine responsibility, it seems that the Talmud presents the view that, and by including in the Talmud, it accepts the view that it's not, you don't get punished for someone else's mistake on a divine level. Now we're looking at a human level. Like if the parents are in violation, does that allow us to expel students from school? Now, also depends on what that violation is. Now, in this case, right, the school felt that the children had to be expelled because their parents were in violation of the parent contract. Right? Anyone who sent children to school know that, often the students have to sign on to certain regulations, but parents also have to sign on to certain regulations. There's a contract. So source number 4, as this issue has started to be discussed by Rabbi Yitzchak Grossman, who is a rabbi in the ultra-Orthodox community, wrote, a girls' school in Brooklyn recently suspended several students due to their parents' affiliation with the breakaway faction of Gerrer Chasidic. The school explained in a public statement that this step was taken after the parents, by choosing to align themselves openly with that group by attending its events, blatantly violated a parent cooperation agreement stating that a child whose parents affiliates themselves with or supports a group that expresses disrespect and contempt towards Gerrer Chinuch or toward our Rebbes, unfortunately has no place in the Chinuch network of Ger. Right, and that, again, that's a very, it's a very large category. It's very amorphous, but you're not allowed to, you're by signing on the parent contract, you're accepting the educational values of the Ger community, led by the Ger Rebbe, and by attending events that have been forbidden by the Ger Rebbe, you're showing contempt for the whole network, and therefore you have no place in the institution. And in fact, the school, in its clarification, pointed out the day after their parents openly joined the group, children from such home came to the school with a defiance. Anti-Ger and anti-Rebbe statements were thrown out into the open in class and between friends. So not only was it that the parents did something that violated the contract, the students were therefore behaving by expressing anti-establishment or anti-Ger Rebbe statements, which would be cause for expulsion. Now, sometimes schools may be more tolerant when these types of things happen, but in this case, since it was part of the rebellious faction within the movement, it was kind of like almost one strike and you're out. Often, when schools do have to discipline, they have to take a little bit more of a tolerant attitude. But here, this was viewed as one of the worst offenses possible of joining the rival faction or making statements against the Rebbe's leadership. And that it wasn't just the parents going, but the students were absorbing that and were articulating that was grounds for expulsion. And so, contracts on behavior of families is not uncommon in the Orthodox educational world. Obviously depends on where in the community you are, but some schools, require certain commitments against the use of certain technologies, certain phones, certain internet access. Right, this is not completely foreign, but it does seem that whereas on some of these other issues, there may be some leeway, some flexibility, some looking the other way. This case in particular struck a nerve because of it cutting right to the heart of who's in charge of the movement. And therefore it led to these repercussions, which required a kind of addressing in a legal forum and got us to where we are today. But what are what does halacha say about behavior of parents leading to the ability to deprive students of an education? And there actually is a halachic concept that serves as a precedent for this. And it's the concept that we don't really encounter very much today, mainly because we don't really have as much of a united community today, but it's the idea of cherem. Cherem, which means excommunication, right? The idea of being part of the community at one point was so significant that you didn't want to do stuff that would make you outside the pale because you'd have nowhere to go, right? You know, the idea of, for example, many of us are familiar, Jews don't marry, are no longer allowed to marry two wives because of Rabbeinu Gershom. Certainly the Ashkenazi community, even in the Sephardic community in Israel, the Sephardic community accepts this idea that a person is only allowed to have one wife. Now, some of the men are thinking, one is plenty, right? But where does this come from? We know, patriarchs had multiple wives. We know that it's something that existed throughout, biblical and rabbinic times. So why all of a sudden is this not allowed? So people talk about Cherem Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom was one of the leaders within the Ashkenazic Jewish community in Germany around the year 1000, and he was known as the great light of the diaspora, and he made a cherem. Now, what's less broadly known, and sometimes people get confused, is that Rabbeinu Gershom did not outlaw two wives. Rabbeinu Gershom said that if you take two wives, you will be put in cherem, which means you won't be allowed to participate in the community. And that was strong enough to solidify this edict, and therefore turned into being forbidden to have two wives. But it was not a prohibition, because you can't prohibit something that the Torah permits. It was something that was that created a cherem. You would be banned if you did it. And so the power of cherem is very significant when there is a strong Jewish communal infrastructure. Less so as the Jewish communal infrastructure weakens, and less so when people have other places to go. So, for example, very famously, Spinoza was excommunicated by the Amsterdam Jewish community. Spinoza didn't really care that much because he didn't really want to be part of it in the first place. But, the idea of a cherem does have halachic precedent, does come with halachic consequences, not only for the individual, but the individual's family. So source number 6 is from the Tshuvot HaGaonim. This is the scholars and sages who led the Babylonian religious institutions, where most of the Torah was being studied right after the Talmud was edited. So you're talking the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century. And they said that we have made a decree that anytime that someone is put in cherem, right, it lasts all day, every day. And it's the middle of the first line. Hichrizu alav shepito pas pusi, v'yeno yen nesech, uperosav tvolim. So we've said that his bread is viewed as non-Jewish bread. His wine is considered as if it is being held and poured by a non-Jew. And his fruit as if it has not been tithed. Usfarav sifrei kusamim, and his religious books that he writes are not religious. Chatchut tzitzosav, the akru mezuzaso, right? And you cut his tzitzis and tear up his mezuzahs. V'lo sochlu imo, v'lo sishtu imo. You should not eat with him or drink with him. V'lo samulu lo ben, v'lo tlamdu es banov Torah beveis hakneses. You should not circumcise his son, nor should you let him study in the synagogue. Let them study Torah. Right? They didn't really have yeshivas then, so it's the lessons in the synagogue. So not only is the person who's being excommunicated being not just don't talk to him, he's almost being viewed himself as not Jewish, and that extends to his children. And so therefore you don't circumcise his son in 8 days, and you don't let the child into school. Sounds a little strict. So Rabbi Yosef Karo, we're moving on to source number 7, felt that this was a little strict, and felt that this sounds strict and is presented as strict because you got to talk tough. We're trying to maintain a communal standard. And he says that these are extra stringencies that the Gaonim made for anyone who would violate their decrees. And they did this because they were like the chief rabbinical authority. They were the Supreme Court. They did this because there was a unified Jewish community. Middle of the second line, Avala achar doram lo nahaguke. after their generation, after there was a more unified generation, as time went on, the communities became looser associations. All of these stringencies weren't necessarily followed. So cherem doesn't mean everything that the Gaonim mentioned, and cherem doesn't necessarily mean you have to take it out on his children. Right? The Rabbi Yosef Karo is saying there's more bark than bite when it comes to cherem, and says that you are allowed to put all of these stringencies into effect, but he says in the last line, Omer ani she'ein laharbos, sheyehe imo kiven shemarucha chumudam mishar ha'am. You shouldn't make so many things to push the person further and further from everybody else. You got to make a statement, but you don't have to really rub it in or take it out onto the children. So you have the Gaonim presented cherem, excommunication, as coming with all of these stringencies. You have Rabbi Yosef Karo, who's living, some 500 years later, pushing back a little bit. Yes, they were strict. Their community was much more insulated, much more centralized. They could do it. It's not really the same for us. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, a contemporary of Rabbi Yosef Karo, saying, the court has the authority to impose stringencies upon one who's been excommunicated and to expel his children from school. He says, that's all fine and good, but you know what? You got to do what you got to do. Don't look at these as stringencies. Look at these as vehicles for correcting the behavior of the one who got himself put into cherem. So how does it play out? So Rabbi Shlomo Luria, who was came in the generation after Rabbi Yosef Karo and Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, he was not in favor of withholding education from someone whose parents were excommunicated. Chalila, right? That's, we say, God forbid, to interrupt the breath of children reciting words of Torah upon which the existence of the whole world depends. It is certainly obvious that there's no justification for the interruption of children's study of Torah, the neglect of which cannot be made up, about which it is said, if you abandon me for 1 day, for 2 days, will I abandon you. Presumably this ruling did not emerge from the mouth of the Gaon. Chalila v'chalila, to remove the sons of those who have been excommunicated from study hall or from the yeshiva. One time in my youth, such an incident came before me, where a certain scholar and elder of his generation, halachic authority, wrote to me requesting that I remove from the yeshiva the son of someone who had been excommunicated, and I paid absolutely no attention to him. No, cherem, excommunication, might be something that someone earns because of their bad behavior, but you should not take it out on the children. You should certainly not take it out on the education of the children. And that was Rabbi Luria's response. So we're seeing that there are clearly sources which mention part of the punishment of the parents being taken out on the children as well. We see that there's some pushback on that. We see there's tremendous pushback from expelling, withholding an education from children because of the sins of the parents. And you have a few other sources which are a little bit more permissive of this practice, to take it out on the education of the children. The conversation continues into the 20th century, where Jewish communal institutions were at times able to impose their will. So source number 12, the Aruch HaShulchan. And the court has the authority to impose stringencies upon one who has been excommunicated and to expel his children from school until he accepts upon himself the law. If they see that by this they will bend his head, secure his submission. But in the absence of such considerations, we do not punish children for the sins of their parents, even small children. Right? The idea of, if you think it will work, we saw this source with regards to when we were discussing vaccine mandates. It's one thing if this type of societal pressure will help, but if it's not going to help, and then you shouldn't be withholding the education from the children because of the sin of the parents. Now, in our case, we also have, in addition to this cherem and withholding the education, is it really a sin? Right? We're talking about following a rival camp within a Hasidic group. Is that a sin? That's not necessarily a sinful behavior. That's more communal politics, but which only muddies the water more. But we see that withholding an education was something that would be utilized as a part of the arsenal of someone who's being excommunicated. We see that already. Rabbi Yosef Karo sees this as distasteful. and Rabbi Shlomo Luria sees this as terrible. And then the Aruch HaShulchan tries to present it as, look, we're dealing with a bad situation, and we're trying to improve the situation. And if improving the situation means making it harsher for the children, if that will actually help improve the situation, that's a tool at our disposal. If it's not going to make a difference, then it's not something that should be invoked in this case. Questions, comments, reactions before we go a little bit more deeply into that issue of how does halacha view expelling students in general?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
in other words, are you saying that from a halachic standpoint, the 6 million did not die necessarily because of the sins of their ancestors?
I from a halakhic standpoint, when bad things happen, we don't know why they happen. I think it is absolutely not in accordance with what the Talmud says or the usual rabbinic approach to bad things happening, to blame them on sins of parents.
You don't necessarily agree entirely with some of the other teachings.
The way what you presented that you heard from Mr. Varoba, something that I would disagree with. I think that that's not a traditional approach. Remember, when we deal with issues like this, you end up with plenty of approaches that are not traditional. As an example, the Satmar Rebbe blamed the Holocaust on the Zionists, right? And that's what he did. I think that's not true. So I think that often bad things bring out sometimes bad explanations of why bad things happen.
Personally, Rabbi, I cannot buy that concept. Just doesn't jive with anything that my mind can absorb. Does not.
Okay, I agree. So what about when it comes to students? Halachic approach to expelling students from school. And in this case, there seems to be a lot of reluctance, if not a halachic prohibition against denying a student an education. And the only time that it becomes considered as even an option is when it's not about the student themselves, it's about that student's impact on other students. So it's not about the student having done something to get expelled themselves, it's about that student being a bad influence on other students. So for example, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, writing on the subject in source 13, we may expel a child from school for being a nuisance, even if by Jewish law he's not accountable or punishable. Our rationale, in essence, is that we are not punishing him. We're simply trying to prevent him from affecting his peers or other children in the school. The idea that we are, very much reluctant, and we see that from Rabbi Shlomo Luria, the idea that we don't want to withhold education from any student. Every student is entitled to education. We have an obligation to give that student education. We have no right to deprive that student of education, to keep that student away from school or expel the student from school, unless that student is negatively aversing, impacting other students, which is why that if you go back to the sources we saw earlier, the response of the Beis Yaakov, the Chasidic Gur, that the issue there was not necessarily only about the parents, but that the behavior was impacting other students as well, right? The idea of that the students came to school with defiance and anti-Gerrer sentiment and anti-Rebbe sentiment, and that was the problem. It wasn't the parents going there; it was the students having a negative impact on other students, which the school tried to hang its hat or its shtreimel on, in this case, in terms of expelling the students. Because there's really no good reason to expel a student, and that it contains also our conversation about even if someone is in cherem, the displeasure that most of the sources see with the exception of it being able to make a difference, the children deserve their education, period. If that one child is depriving other children of an education, well, then that becomes something that's more serious and requires addressing, not because the student that's impacting is not entitled to the education, but it's kind of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one, as Spock said in the Wrath of Khan at the end. But for those who are Trekkies. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein puts onto this, even another layer of complexity. He says, similarly to the way Rav Schechter presented it in the last source in Hebrew, we'll translate. If the student is bringing down, is causing, ruining the educational experience of others, you certainly have to remove him. You have to be very deliberative about this, and you have to be very careful about this. It's like matters of life and death. Right? So adding on that veneer that when it comes to education and decisions made, educational decisions that are made, in particular decisions that are made that will deprive a student of an education, even if there's a justifiable reason, don't just act, don't shoot from the hip, don't treat this as a minor decision. That too seems to be, at least my perspective looking at what happened in this situation seems to be, maybe to the outsider's view, what they did in that school to suspend, expel the 100 girls whose fathers participated in the wrong tish. It wasn't a Dinei Nefashos issue. They were not being as deliberative about it. If you go online, you can read their whole defense. But they're worried about schism in the community, and they're worried about Rebbe defiance, and it doesn't seem that much worse than typical child's play that goes on. But to really withhold an education for people, you have to treat that as seriously as a capital crime. And so I think that in this particular case, which was analyzing how should the children suffer, should children pay for their parents' sins, look, that is something that has a Torah concept, which Yecheskel seems to have said that no longer is relevant. That's not how we look at things that are happening. Sometimes when a parent does something to become excommunicated, it becomes relevant. Certainly, to deprive an education would seem a very harsh step, which may have once had a certain relevance, and maybe we'll be able to bring the excommunicated parents back in line. But still, you have to treat it very seriously, because the only time you're allowed to deprive a student of education, to expel a student, is when that student is truly disruptive, ruining the educational experience of everybody else. Because these are not just matters of instruction; these are matters of life and death. So that is a little bit of theology, a little bit of Hasidic politics, a little bit of Hasidic news on this subject, ripped from the headline.